Tonight, we drift toward a sliver of rock in the East China Sea, a place so small it might vanish from your GPS if you sneezed. The waves lap gently, the moon casts a silver glow over jagged cliffs, and seagulls shriek as if they know something you don't. Beneath that tranquil surface, however, simmers a tension so old and so fierce it could wake even the sleepiest diplomat. This, dear listener, is not just a rock, it's a political minefield. And, spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive the first international incident you'd accidentally start by stepping foot there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You float over choppy waters toward an archipelago that barely deserves the title. Some are no more than cliffy teeth biting out of the sea, covered in sparse vegetation and seabird guano. The largest one, Utsurishima, is barely 5 square kilometers, just enough land to pace around before you get bored. Yet these islets, collectively called the Senkaku Islands by Japan and the Diaoyu Islands by China, are a geopolitical hot potato flung back and forth since the late 20th century, with the occasional third party awkwardly trying not to get burned. The air here is quiet, eerily so. No towns, no ports, no gift shops hawking "I survived the Senkaku selfie zone" t-shirts. Just nature, raw and indifferent, pretending not to notice the surveillance drones above. Beneath you is a seabed, rich with fish crustaceans and allegedly oil and gas deposits. And that, as you'll find out, is a big reason why everyone suddenly cares so much about these sleepy islets. But tonight you're not a pundit or a policymaker. You're just a ghostly observer gliding across centuries of silence, conflict and symbolism. The waves whisper secrets about forgotten fishermen and unnamed emperors. You hear the scratch of ancient quills on parchment and the hiss of torches on diplomatic parchment. The roots of this conflict sink deep, not in the rocky soil of the islands themselves, but in the murky waters of history. Before GPS, before nationalism, even before international law had anything to say about borders, these islands were simply waypoints. Resting spots for seafarers, occasionally a temporary camp for fishing expeditions. Nobody planted flags, nobody raised taxes there. It was, in the eyes of many historians, a geopolitical shrug. Still, maps from the Ming dynasty sometimes show these islands. Ming naval logs mention safe havens in the East China Sea, and some of those coordinates line up suspiciously well with today's contested rocks. At the same time, Japanese navigators, especially from Okinawa and the Ryukyu Kingdom, charted the same waters for centuries. So who was first? Well, historians still argue whether those old maps are decisive proof or just suggestive ink blots. You land softly atop the largest island. It smells of salt guano and oddly significance. This island, Utsurishima, might not look like much, but its name means fish catch island in Japanese, which tells you exactly what it used to be valued for. And while today it might host the occasional nationalist hiker or be patrolled from a distance by drones and Coast Guard vessels for centuries, it was an afterthought, a pit stop, a dash on a sailor's sketchbook. That changed slowly then, all at once. But for now, just let the ocean breeze cool your face as you lie under a star-studded sky, not far from where Taiwanese fishermen still whisper stories of old expeditions to this very shore. Nobody built a shrine here, nobody farmed, and yet somehow the world still managed to make this barren place the stage for one of the most enduring diplomatic rivalries in East Asia. There's something darkly humorous about it. You imagine two world powers squabbling over a rock that can't even host a hotel buffet. You picture military analysts squinting at satellite photos of bird poop patterns. And somewhere, a lone seagull laughs. You wake to the low hum of tension, not the kind that echoes with gunfire or shouts, but the taut quiet of meaning layered upon a place where almost nothing happens. That's the contradiction of the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. The drama isn't in the landscape, which offers no romance, just wind-swept rock stubby grass and the occasional stubborn shrub. No, the drama lives in the names. And tonight, we're going to peel back that linguistic onion. You're standing on a cliff edge, barefoot, feeling the grit of volcanic dust beneath your toes. The waves roll endlessly, same as they have for millennia. But above you, flags wave imaginary, conflicting, invisible banners, flapping in the wind of decades-old declarations. On one side, Senkaku Islands, the Japanese name institutionalized since the late 19th century. On the other, Diaoyu, the Chinese name used since at least the Ming dynasty. To complicate your insomnia further, Taiwan calls them Diaoyu Tai, the fishing platform. And somewhere in an old English naval log they're once whimsically referred to as Pinnacle Islands, a title that sounds more like a brand of bottled water than a flashpoint in Asia-Pacific relations. You wonder, how can something so tiny have so many names? But that's the thing, names aren't just labels here. They're claims, stories, stakes in the ground that say we were here first. It's like a high school yearbook where everyone swears they were the first to sign the back cover. Japan argues that it formally incorporated the islands in 1895, just before the Treaty of Shimonoseki ended the First Sino-Japanese War. China retorts that the islands were already charted in its nautical records centuries before that, and that Japan's annexation was sneaky piggybacking off war while pretending it had nothing to do with war. Historians still argue whether Japan's 1895 move was legal, terra nullius occupation of unclaimed land, or opportunistic appropriation of Chinese territory at a time when China was weakened and disorganized. The paperwork was certainly quiet, no announcements, no parades, just a decision sealed and filed in the snowy bureaucratic recesses of the Japanese cabinet. Not exactly the stuff of swashbuckling imperial conquest, but effective nonetheless. You step lightly across the jagged ground, imagining for a moment that you're a bureaucrat with a scroll and ink brush renaming this place for the emperor. The act feels weightless and heavy at once. Once a place has a name, people can argue about it. People can teach their children to care about it. It can show up on test questions or in street protests or on the evening news. And protests they do. Whenever tensions flare, cities in both countries erupt in choreographed outrage. Banners wave, rocks get thrown. Nationalist YouTubers hop on scooters with GoPros trying to plant flags like they're playing a very tense version of Capture the Island. And through it all, the names repeat like mantras. Diaoyu is China's chant university students in Beijing. Senkaku belongs to Japan Echo Voices in Tokyo. It's a tragic call and response duet where nobody's singing in harmony. A quirky detail: during one flashpoint in 2012, the Tokyo governor at the time proposed buying the islands from their private Japanese owner using public donations. Yes, you heard that right. Crowdfunded nationalism. And people actually donated millions of yen to buy barren rock. That's how powerful names are. They transform a pile of stone into an object of national pride worth opening your wallet for. As the wind picks up, you picture an alternate world where everyone agreed on a neutral name. Something silly, Bob Island, or Disagreement Rock. Maybe then the world could sleep better. But names matter because stories matter, and the stories wrapped around this island are dripping with the blood, ink, and egos of centuries. Each name is a chapter in a much larger book, one that's still being written in daily headlines and quiet Coast Guard standoffs. Your gaze lifts toward the mainland. Far away, cities pulse with light and life, but here it's just you, the stars, and this battered symbol. You can't help but feel it, the weird weight of symbolic territory. It's not about who lives here, it's about who belongs here. And the way each side insists on its name reveals that they're not just fighting over land, they're fighting over history itself. Who gets to tell it? Who gets to define it? Who gets to win it? And you realize something strange and deeply human. The fight over names might be the only thing keeping the place important. If everyone agreed to stop caring, to call it nothing at all, would the islands just disappear from memory? Become just rocks again? Somehow that feels even sadder. So you sit on the edge, watching seabirds swoop in lazy arcs overhead, and the waves whisper the same names over and over. Senkaku, Diaoyu, Pinnacle. ghost syllables that echo into the night long after the nations that named them are gone. You linger there on the island's lonely bluff, but now the sea shifts beneath you, not just in waves, but in time. Your senses stretch centuries back until the radar towers and political speeches fade, and you begin to see the islands not as disputed territory, but as rest stops for the forgotten. There are no flags here now, only salt-worn sails bobbing in the distance belonging to fishermen who knew the tides better than any law. Before Japan and China became modern nation-states with embassies, prime ministers, and angry press releases, they were just coastal communities, families scraping life from the sea, and these islands, they were a convenience, not a prize. You imagine it? Now your boat creaking against the current nets, dragging, and the island appearing on the horizon like a sigh of relief. Not land to live on, land to lean on. Historical records from both sides show that Chinese fishermen from Fujian and Zhejiang provinces used these islands as resting spots while sailing to the Ryukyu kingdom centuries before steam engines or gunboats made the region a geopolitical theater. Likewise, records from the Ryukyu kingdom, later absorbed into Japan, describe similar use pauses, pit stops, anchorage. The islands were not owned so much as tolerated. Like a public bench, nobody dares to vandalize. What's curious and often overlooked in today's chest-pounding is how long these communities coexisted. Chinese junks and Okinawan skiffs passed each other without raising cannons or waving treaties. Sometimes they shared resources, sometimes they ignored each other. But the sea was vast and the islands were too barren to fight over. Back then, nature did the gatekeeping. Hurricanes reminded you not to linger. Typhoons showed you what happens when humans think they can tame ocean loneliness. You walk the imagined shore now, hearing voices that history books tend to forget. An old Chinese sailor muttering about spoiled fish, a Ryukyuan youth carving his name into a driftwood post. Their worlds were small, their needs immediate. They weren't trying to draw borders, they were trying not to starve. Fringe records hint at unusual uses too. One Qing-era logbook suggests a crew once buried their sick on the largest island to avoid bringing disease back to the mainland. Another story, likely apocryphal but widely repeated, tells of a fishing boat that carved a shelter into the rock wall only to have it destroyed by a storm and repurposed by Japanese sailors decades later. Whether these stories are fact or fisherman's fantasy, they serve the same purpose. They root the islands in a human narrative deeper than flags and treaties. Historians still argue whether these casual visits count as effective control, the gold standard for territorial claims in modern international law. Did tossing anchor and drying fish imply sovereignty? Did recording it in a maritime logbook count? Or does sovereignty require a tax office and a postmaster? The answer, as with most things here, is well, it depends who you ask. And here's a quirky modern twist. In recent years, both Japan and China have tried to retroactively document ancient use, scouring archives, even creating museum exhibits to showcase how their people used the islands for centuries. You can almost imagine a future where school kids compete in island use trivia battles and the winning country gets a temporary flag placement rights, like capture the flag, but with more paperwork. But as you pace these rocks barefoot in your dreams, you realize what matters most. For hundreds of years, nobody needed a government's permission to fish here. The people who relied on these islands lived lives far removed from the bureaucracies now using their ghosts as political leverage. They didn't sign treaties or write white papers. They tied knots, watched the skies, and hoped their catch was enough to feed a family. The islands were not symbols, they were tools. And you wonder if you could pluck one of those fishermen from history and show him today's mess Coast Guard ships circling like sharks, diplomats fuming into microphones, school kids reciting nationalist slogans. What would he think? Probably that everyone's making too much noise over not enough land. You recline in your invisible hammock, letting the waves lap at your thoughts, and the ancient voices fade back into the tide. The islands remain where they've always been, unmoved, unconvinced, and possibly amused. The sea mists over again, and time spins once more, this time to the age of ink-drenched imperial courts and serious men in long robes debating matters you and I would fall asleep halfway through. But tonight, we're not falling asleep just yet. We're gliding through archives over brittle parchment and into the minds of dynasties that didn't even agree on where their empires ended, let alone where a fishing island fit into the picture. Now you're in the 15th century, hovering above a scholar bent over a silk map under the dim glow of a flickering lantern. His brush dances in delicate arcs, sketching landwind patterns and waypoints across an imagined sea. On his scroll just west of the Ryukyu chain you spot it, Diaoyu Dao. There it is, in black ink, a speck on the route from China to the kingdom of Ryukyu, placed as a navigational landmark. The Ming dynasty, in all its paper-pushing glory, recorded such details for tribute missions and trade, not for bragging rights, but modern eyes see those marks very differently. China's argument today leans heavily on such Ming-era documents. The voyage with a tailwind, an imperial record of tribute missions from the 1400s, lists the islands as markers passed en route to Okinawa. Later, Qing documents double down, calling the islands part of China's maritime perimeter. But here's the twist: historians still argue whether these records describe sovereignty or just recognition. Think of it this way: mentioning a gas station on the road to Vegas doesn't mean you own it. It means you noticed it while passing by. Meanwhile, over in Japan, things were busy too, albeit in a different rhythm. The Ryukyu kingdom, which had close ties to both China and Japan, also noted the islands in their logs. Yet the Japanese central government based in Edo, now Tokyo, didn't really show much interest until centuries later. That changed in the 1800s when Japan was starting to look outwards, hungry to modernize, expand and, yes, plant flags. One of the quirkiest pieces of evidence Japan points to is a survey from 1885. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan sent officials to inspect the islands for strategic use. They reported the place was uninhabited and pretty useless, but worth keeping an eye on. It's the imperial version of bookmarking a website might be valuable later. Japan later officially incorporated the islands in 1895 through a cabinet decision quietly, with no public fanfare, arguably to avoid conflict with China, who was neck-deep in the First Sino-Japanese War at the time. Here's where the plot thickens. That same year, the Treaty of Shimonoseki ended the war with a clause handing over Taiwan and nearby islands to Japan. China claims the Diaoyu Islands were included in that nearby islands batch and should have been returned after World War II. Japan says, nope, they were incorporated before the treaty, so they weren't part of it. You see where this is going? It's a historical version of I called shotgun before you even knew we were getting in the car. There's also the question of Western cartographers. European maps from the 18th and 19th centuries often labeled the islands using both Japanese and Chinese terminology, sometimes even both on the same map, as if the cartographer just didn't want to get involved. A 1785 British chart calls them Pinnacle Islands, a name so non-committal it sounds like someone describing a line of hiking boots. Still, modern analysts comb through these old maps like tea leaves, trying to determine which empire had more cartographic love for the place. Some maps lean Chinese, others Japanese. Some are frustratingly ambiguous, like that one roommate who sort of paid rent. And historians, they still argue whether these ancient and colonial era documents actually hold legal weight in the age of satellites and GPS. But even if they don't, they hold emotional weight, and that in this saga matters just as much. As you sit on an invisible ridge beside an imaginary Ming official muttering about monsoons and coral reefs, you realize this isn't just about a pile of rocks. It's about narrative. Both nations want their stories validated, their ancestors acknowledged. For China, it's proof of deep cultural reach, a nod to a time when the Middle Kingdom's influence stretched from steppes to seas. For Japan, it's about legitimacy, proof that the post-Meiji expansion wasn't just random grabbing but careful stewardship. You run your fingers over the ghostly texture of a painted scroll. You wonder how differently things would have played out if one of those old maps had scribbled in big red ink, "Do not touch, property of insert empire here." But instead, what we have are subtle lines, vague labels, and enough ambiguity to fuel over a century of arguments. The sea doesn't care, but the people sure do. So the names on the map become more than ink. They become memory, inheritance, and ammunition. And as your eyes close for a moment, the waves ripple again, carrying whispers of both Ming sailors and Meiji officers, none of whom could have imagined that someday scholars in suits would argue passionately over their doodles. The breeze stiffens with the scent of brine and something else, something faintly fishy and oddly expensive. As you drift forward in time out of dusty archives and into salt-stained boots, you begin to hear a different language whispered through the sea foam. Not Chinese, not Japanese, just the grumble of trade, the gossip of smugglers, and the sizzle of sea cucumbers drying in the sun. Yes, sea cucumbers. Tonight that's your unlikely escort through the murky waters of early modern East Asia. These squishy little creatures, gelatinous and vaguely unfortunate looking, were considered a delicacy in China for centuries. In the 17th and 18th centuries, traders, especially those from Okinawa and the surrounding Ryukyu Islands, realized that there was serious money to be made gathering them from these little islands and shipping them to the Qing imperial court. And where sea cucumbers go, people follow. The Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, sitting in that sweet spot between Okinawa and China's southeastern coast, became part of this quiet maritime web. They didn't host buildings, but they hosted activity. Fishermen dried sea cucumbers on the rocks, taking advantage of the blistering sun and isolation. Sailors stored emergency supplies there. Smugglers possibly offloaded contraband. No passports were stamped, and no embassies took notes, but the islands were busy in their own quiet, salty way. This activity makes things fuzzier, not clearer. If Chinese and Japanese fishermen both used the islands regularly, who had the stronger claim? Well, historians still argue whether use equals ownership when it's happening informally without the backing of a government. The same question pops up today when people point at old fishing logs and say, "See proof," while others squint and say, "Sure, but whose flag was flying?" By the 18th century, the Ryukyu Kingdom had developed strong trade links with both China and Japan, often acting as a tributary state to China, while also becoming more closely entwined with Japan. It was, in essence, playing both sides and doing a decent job of it. This diplomatic ambiguity is key. The Ryukyus recorded using the islands, too, especially for trade voyages and as storm shelters. But they weren't exactly staking a flag into the rock and shouting sovereignty. They were stopping for snacks, maybe mending a sail. Meanwhile, pirates were busy rewriting the region's unwritten rules. Maritime raiders prowled the East China Sea, disrupting trade, robbing boats, and even occupying small islands for short periods. There are tales, some based, in fact others, whispered in coastal tea houses of pirates camping out on Watsurishima, or dropping anchor at night to hide from authorities. One story speaks of a pirate ship that got stranded there during a storm and had to eat its own cargo. If that cargo was dried sea cucumber, one can only hope they had plenty of water. A strange fringe detail surfaces here. Some Qing dynasty sources referred to certain islets in the region as useless for farming, but useful for drying goods. That's about as glamorous as a land claim gets. Imagine your landlord writing, "Yeah, the backyard is good for drying socks and scaring away birds." But in international law, those scribbles become footnotes in sovereignty debates. Add enough footnotes and suddenly even a rock covered in bird droppings becomes a geopolitical celebrity. Quirky as it sounds, sea cucumbers were a driver of the early economy in the East China Sea, one of many humble commodities that left surprisingly large footprints. There was also agar, a gelatinous seaweed used in cooking and medicine, and bêche de mer, another squishy seafood export that sounds fancy until you see it in a bucket. These items wouldn't win beauty contests, but they made the region's fishermen, and eventually their patrons, care about those little dots in the sea. You picture it, a modest boat rocking in the waves, deck lined with drying trays, crew members yawning under straw hats, muttering about wind patterns and supply prices. They weren't thinking about international law, they weren't envisioning radar installations or satellite photos. They were just surviving and maybe scraping together enough for a new oar or a better hat. Still, by using the islands regularly, these fishermen unintentionally left breadcrumbs of presence. And presence in the eyes of modern governments is the golden ticket to effective control. The problem is both sides were present, both left their nets and their footprints. Neither left a government building or a formal flagpole, and so the ambiguity grew like barnacles on the hull of history. It's also worth noting that none of these island users seemed to settle there. There were no long-term residences, no temples, no cemeteries. The islands were always temporary, transient, impermanent. Like a friend's couch you crash on during a storm, handy, appreciated, but not home. That's what makes modern territorial claims so awkward. Countries are now fighting over places their own ancestors never cared enough to inhabit. But the stakes have changed, because now those rocky beaches and storm-battered cliffs might be hiding oil beneath them. They might be sitting on a military vantage point. And more than anything, they sit at the crossroads of national ego and historical memory. So as you stand once again on Watsuri-shima, toes pressed against the stone, you can almost smell centuries of brine and ambition. You imagine fishermen laying out their harvest beside modern officials, laying out legal claims, each of them trying to make something out of nothing. The clouds darken, but not with rain, with paperwork. The 19th century rolls in like a steamship blowing away the era of wooden boats and silent shorelines. The imperial age, where wars were followed by treaties and treaties were filled with footnotes, now hovers over the islands like a bureaucratic fog. And in that fog, Japan makes a move, quietly, strategically, and with a pen. You're now drifting over Tokyo in 1895. The Meiji Restoration has turned Japan into a nation in a hurry, modernizing its army, copying Prussian institutions, and scanning the map for territories that weren't nailed down. The First Sino-Japanese War is nearing its end. China is weakened, distracted, and scrambling. It is in this moment, precisely on January 14, 1895, that Japan's government decides to incorporate the Senkaku Islands. Not with fireworks, not with a colonist ship and a marching band, just a cabinet meeting, a few signatures, a formality, like stapling an extra receipt to the empire's growing binder. Here's the twist: they didn't tell anyone. No announcement, no formal note to China, not even a memo to the guy drying sea cucumbers. It was done under the radar, with the justification that the islands were uninhabited and showed no trace of Chinese administration. According to Japan, this was a simple application of terra nullius land that belongs to no one available to the first effective occupier. China then and now sees it very differently. Chinese officials argue that Japan took advantage of wartime chaos to quietly snatch what was clearly part of its maritime territory. To Beijing's historical lens, this wasn't a neutral act, it was a land grab masked in legal niceties. And because the islands were small and remote, the world didn't blink. It was the geopolitical version of pocketing loose change from a neighbor's dresser while they were hospitalized. Historians still argue whether this 1895 incorporation was a strategic move done out of genuine ambiguity or an opportunistic exploitation of wartime distraction. Supporters of Japan's claim say the move was legal and followed international norms of the time. Critics say it was legal only in the sense that no one stopped them, hardly a moral high ground. What really complicated matters was what came next, the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Signed in April 1895, the treaty officially ended the First Sino-Japanese War. Among other things, it ceded Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands to Japan in perpetuity. But here's the kicker. The treaty doesn't mention the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands by name. Were they part of the cession or not? Japan says no. The incorporation happened months before the treaty and therefore wasn't part of the post-war spoils. China says yes, or at least strongly implies it, arguing that the islands were administratively linked to Taiwan and should have been returned after World War II along with the rest of Taiwan's territory. The lack of clarity turned that treaty into a century-long migraine. And here's an odd little footnote. One Japanese report from the late 1890s mentions that the islands were now being leased to a family from Okinawa for use as a fish processing base. Oh, that's right. After all the drama, the first post-incorporation move was to hand the islands off to a seaweed entrepreneur named Koga Tatsushiro. He set up a bonito drying operation and eventually brought in dozens of workers. It wasn't much, but it gave Japan something valuable, a civilian presence. A foot in the door. Meanwhile, China, reeling from defeat and domestic unrest, had bigger problems than a cluster of windswept rocks. The Qing dynasty was collapsing under the weight of corruption, rebellion, and foreign encroachment. The islands, like so many other disputed territories in history, became a victim of poor timing. If the Qing had been stronger, more organized, or more suspicious, they might have contested the move. But history loves a distracted victim. You hover above the islands, now imagining the lonely buildings Koga built, wooden sheds full of fishy fumes, the occasional worker gazing westward toward China. There were no military bases, no lighthouses, just industry. The kind of everyday humble industry that in hindsight becomes historical gold. Japan would later point to these buildings as effective occupation, the magic phrase in sovereignty law. China, on the other hand, views them as illegal squatters on stolen land. Fast forward a bit, and Japan continues to administer the islands as part of Okinawa. They appear in official maps. The fishing operation lasts until World War II. Then, once again, the islands fall quiet. But that silence, it's deceptive, because behind the quiet, the seeds of long-term confusion are already in bloom. Treaties that didn't name names, occupation without notification, a war followed by a grab, and then a peace built on a mission. It's as if everyone agreed to write the islands into the margins until those margins started to matter. So now you sit again on the edge of the biggest island, letting your fingers trace the ghost outlines of Koga's forgotten buildings. A seabird screeches overhead. You imagine him shouting, "This is mine," in Japanese. Then another bird in Mandarin screeching back, and a third bird confused and possibly Taiwanese asking, "Wait, who are we yelling at again?" The sun sets, but the paper trail remains faint, brittle, and deeply contested. Night deepens over the East China Sea, but history doesn't sleep, especially not in the post-war era. You float now into the 20th century's most theatrical act, the American intermission. Yes, just when China and Japan thought the argument might stay between them, in walks the United States, fresh from World War II, and armed with bases, bombers, and bureaucracy. And just like that, the islands you've been quietly hovering over become property in a global game of hot potato. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Allied powers, led of course by the US, took control of its occupied territories, including Okinawa and its surrounding islets. And so the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, came under American administration as part of the United States civil administration of the Ryukyu Islands, a mouthful even for a Pentagon typist. For nearly 3 decades, the US acted as a kind of absentee landlord over the islands, building absolutely nothing on them, but storing something nearby: weapons, lots and lots of weapons. There's a curious fact buried here. In the 1950s and 60s, the US reportedly considered storing nuclear warheads on Okinawa. And while the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands themselves were too small and exposed for that sort of hardware, they were noted in military planning documents as being of strategic interest. Not quite beachfront real estate, but close enough to merit a few dotted lines on a general's clipboard. Still, the Americans didn't claim the islands as US territory. They were caretakers, not owners, like a house sitter who waters the plants but doesn't open the mail. And when Okinawa was returned to Japan in 1972, through the Okinawa Reversion Agreement, the islands were handed back with it. Now here's where the waters get choppier than a cold ramen noodle. China didn't object at first. In fact, there are official Chinese maps from the 1950s that labeled the islands as part of Japan. Textbooks did too, but in the late 1960s, something glittery and greasy was discovered in the seabed around the island's oil. Specifically, surveys conducted by the UN Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East in 1969 hinted at vast hydrocarbon deposits lurking beneath the sea floor. Suddenly, the sleepy islets weren't just rocks, they were potentially floating atop treasure. And what followed was a swift pivot in diplomatic tone. Chinese leaders, previously silent on the island's status, began asserting historical ownership. Beijing claimed that the islands were part of Taiwan's administrative territory, and since Taiwan had been ceded under duress and was due for return, so were the islands. Taiwan's own government, the Republic of China, exiled and still clinging to its own seat of authority, agreed. Awkward. Historians still argue whether China's claim would have emerged so forcefully without that UN oil report. Was it a delayed reaction to occupation, or was it, as skeptics suggest, a sudden interest fueled by black gold? Either way, 1971 marked a turning point. Protests erupted in both China and Taiwan. Japanese citizens waved their own flags. American diplomats tried to slide quietly out the side door. Here's a fun tidbit lost in most textbooks. In 1971, Taiwan's government authorized its Coast Guard to patrol near the islands, and at one point a Taiwanese patrol boat chased away a Japanese fishing vessel with warning shots. It was the maritime version of a bark louder than your bite. Nobody died, but it set a tone. By the time the 1972 reversion happened, Japan resumed formal administrative control over the islands, claiming that the US handover validated its sovereignty. China and Taiwan both protested furiously, saying the handover was illegitimate and ignored their territorial rights. The US, for its part, pulled the ultimate diplomatic shrug. We're just returning administrative rights. Sovereignty. That's between y'all. Good luck. This legal hair-splitting still defines the conflict. You see, the US never said Japan owned the islands. It merely said Japan could administer them. It's like giving your friend the house keys, but telling the neighbors, I'm not saying it's his house, I just need someone to feed the cat. And so the ambiguity persisted, weaponized, exploited, and reheated by politicians and pundits on all sides. Meanwhile, the islands remained uninhabited, their rocky cliffs untouched by this diplomatic tangle. No monuments were built, no oil was drilled. But the idea of oil lingered like a mirage, an invisible hand that shaped policy from afar. You hover again over Watsurishima, and now ghostly outlines of American helicopters fade in and out of view. You hear snatches of military chatter, the buzz of Cold War strategy meetings, and the clink of coffee mugs in Okinawa mess halls. None of them imagined their presence would add decades of fuel to an already sensitive territorial debate. But geopolitics has a long memory, and the ghosts of occupation do not fade easily. Somewhere, an American diplomat rubs his temples, whispering, "We should have just built a McDonald's on it. At least then someone would have claimed it." But instead, the islands sat untouched like a gift no one could open without triggering a family feud. And so by the 1970s, you had a perfect diplomatic storm. 3 claimants, 1 mysterious oil report, and a fading superpower saying, "Not my problem." The stage was set. The real show, the protests, the Coast Guard chases, the PR wars was just beginning. The 1970s were supposed to be chill. Disco was rising, détente was in the air, and bell-bottoms were hiding regrettable choices. But over in the east, China Sea, the mood was anything but mellow. Because while the US was doing the diplomatic moonwalk away from responsibility, the countries around these lonely islands were suddenly charging toward them, fists clenched, paperwork flying, and in one case a fishing boat captain waving a flag like it was the last slice of pizza at a diplomatic summit. Here's what changed everything: oil. Well, maybe. No one ever confirmed the full extent of those sweet hydrocarbon deposits under the islands, but that didn't matter. The mere suggestion whispers of untapped black gold transformed the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands from quiet fishing stops into gleaming strategic assets. National pride fused with fossil fuel ambition, not the coziest bedtime combo. In 1971, shortly after the UN's oil-teasing report, Japan made administrative control official, absorbing the islands into Okinawa Prefecture. They didn't throw a parade, just a quiet bureaucratic update. But China and Taiwan weren't having it. Suddenly both were filing protests, issuing official statements, and appearing in press conferences with maps older than some countries. And then it happened. In 1978, a group of Japanese right-wing activists landed on the largest island, Watsurishima, and did what nationalists do best: they planted a flag. No permit, no permission, just some men, a flagpole, and a whole lot of political performance. It was meant as a statement: these rocks are ours. What they didn't expect was the storm that followed. China erupted. Mass student protests broke out across major cities. Eggs were hurled at the Japanese embassy. Effigies burned. And while it's hard to throw a rock all the way from Beijing to the East China Sea, symbolically, that's exactly what they did. The protesters weren't just angry about a flag on a rock, they were furious at the memory of Japanese occupation, the wounds of war, and what they saw as history being stolen and repackaged with polite Japanese fonts. Historians still argue whether the protests were spontaneous or state-orchestrated. Most agree it was a bit of both. Chinese leadership had a habit of letting nationalist emotions boil just enough to apply pressure, but not so much that they boiled over. It's the international equivalent of a parent saying, "I'm not telling you to yell at your brother," but Taiwan too got in on the action. Fishermen began organizing expeditions to sail near the islands, staking claim through presents. The coast guards of all three players began playing a maritime version of cat and mouse, tailing each other, flashing lights, blaring loudspeakers. Every once in a while, one boat would get a little too close, a little too loud, and a minor collision would spark another round of press statements and public outrage. A quirky footnote: in the 1990s, a group of Hong Kong activists made a series of daring landings on the islands. One man, David Chan, tragically drowned during an attempted landing. His death turned him into a martyr in the eyes of many Chinese nationalists, and annual commemorations followed. Some protesters even brought urns to scatter ashes on the islands. If that sounds a bit intense for an uninhabited rock, that's because it is. But intensity is the lifeblood of this story. Then came the fishing boats. In the early 2000s, tensions escalated further when Japanese Coast Guard ships began aggressively patrolling the area, chasing off Chinese and Taiwanese fishermen. In response, Chinese activists and nationalists launched expeditions, some symbolic, others sincerely hoping to cast a net. More than once, activists landed, were detained, and later deported with great fanfare. One such incident in 2010 ignited an international firestorm. A Chinese fishing boat collided with two Japanese patrol vessels. Japan arrested the captain, sparking immediate outrage from Beijing, which demanded his release. Beijing retaliated with unofficial trade slowdowns and travel restrictions, what many called diplomatic judo. Eventually, Japan backed down and released the captain, but the damage was done. The islands weren't just back in the news, they were front-page headlines. Historians still argue whether the 2010 incident was an intentional provocation or an unlucky bump in rough waters. Either way, it catalyzed a new era of island obsession. Nationalist documentaries were made. Public rallies doubled in size. Japanese and Chinese school textbooks began dedicating pages to the islands, often with language that would make a UN translator break into a nervous sweat. One of the most telling details of this era: merchandise. Yep, you could buy mugs, hats, and t-shirts declaring loyalty to your preferred name, Senkaku or Diaoyu. There were animated characters based on the island's adorable anthropomorphic rocks, smiling with passive-aggressive intensity. Nationalism had gone retail, and all the while the islands themselves remained the same. Empty, windy, tired. At one point, Japanese activists placed a Shinto shrine on one island. Not to worship, really, but to plant cultural roots, symbolic territory making. Chinese activists responded with YouTube videos shot from boats quoting ancient poetry while brandishing scrolls. The drama was equal parts solemn and surreal. You stand now in the imagined center of all this, on that same island where flags were planted and removed, where protesters wept and Coast Guard ships played high-stakes bumper boats, and you realize something strange. This isn't about what the island is, it's about what the island represents. It's about war memory, it's about national identity, it's about the fear of weakness and the weight of historical humiliation. And yes, it's about oil, but oil just lit the match. What burned was pride. The rocks never asked for this, but they got it anyway. Morning breaks gently over the islands, but the sea doesn't sparkle. It pulses with the low hum of engines and the quiet drama of maritime theatre. Now you're not alone. Far on the horizon, faint shadows take shape. Ships, dozens of them, tracing slow arcs around invisible lines. Crews alert, but silent radars spinning like uneasy compasses. Welcome to the age of the standoff, where flags are flown, maps are sighted, and no one dares blink first. You drift closer, and now you see them clearly. Japanese Coast Guard vessels, white hulls, gleaming under the morning sun, blue and red stripes like bureaucratic war paint. Just across the line, though there's no line you can actually see, Chinese maritime patrol ships inch forward, grey hulls, bristling with cameras and antennae, louder in posture than in sound. Each crew knows their job is to maintain presence, not start a war, but everyone also knows what a single bad decision could mean. This isn't a new thing. Since the 2000s, Japan and China have been playing a careful, deliberate game of cat and mouse around these islands. Japan, claiming administrative control since 1972, keeps patrol ships nearby almost constantly. China, asserting undeniable historical sovereignty, sends vessels to contest that control, sometimes daily, sometimes in fleets. It's a choreography of caution, each side wanting to appear strong, but not reckless. And of course, in true East Asian complexity, Taiwan has a few boats in the mix too. Less frequent, but just as firm in their claims. You've got three players circling the same chess square, each pretending the others aren't following the same instructions. Historians still argue whether this maritime standoff is genuinely dangerous or merely symbolic. It's tempting to call it ritualized nationalism, a kind of oceanic kabuki where everyone sticks to their roles. But it's also true that these encounters occasionally spike in intensity. A misinterpreted maneuver, a sonar ping that sounds too much like targeting, or a captain who's had too much coffee, that's all it takes for caution to fray. Take 2012. That year, the Japanese government purchased 3 of the 5 main islands from a private Japanese citizen. The goal was to nationalize the property to prevent Tokyo's more extremist governor from buying it and escalating things even further. Ironically, the move was meant to reduce tension. Instead, it lit a diplomatic match. China erupted again with protests, cancelled diplomatic meetings, and the now familiar boycotts of Japanese goods. Japanese car dealerships in China were vandalized. Sushi restaurants temporarily rebranded themselves with patriotic menu names. A fringe moment from this time deserves a sleepy smile. A Japanese pop idol once tweeted, "Support for the government's move to nationalize the islands." Within hours, Chinese fans flooded her social media, accusing her of imperialism. She apologized, but not before issuing a statement clarifying that she wasn't trying to start World War III, she just liked singing. Even so, the drama on the waves intensified. That same year, Chinese government ships began entering what Japan defined as its territorial waters around the islands, regularly, deliberately, and with cameras rolling. Japan responded with its own surveillance. These encounters became almost daily. It was like a group project where everyone insists they're the leader and refuses to log off Zoom. And the boats aren't alone. Overhead drones zip by. Surveillance planes make lazy loops. In one incident, a Chinese fighter jet came within a few meters of a Japanese military aircraft. Neither side backed down. Both issued angry press statements. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the fish probably thought, could you not? That's another layer: fishing rights. The waters around the islands are rich with fish, and local fishermen, especially from Taiwan and Okinawa, have often been caught in the political undertow. There have been arrests, impoundments, even water cannon skirmishes. In 2013, Japan and Taiwan managed to sign a historic fisheries agreement allowing shared access in part of the contested zone. China, notably, was not invited. You can imagine the reaction. What makes this even more surreal is the frequency with which both sides invoke peace while circling each other with vessels that could cause a minor war. China insists it wants stability. Japan says it's defending the status quo. Both are telling the truth, their truth, but they're standing on opposite shores of it. And behind it all, the public watches. Nationalists on both sides post grainy footage of their Coast Guard bravely shadowing the other side. Twitter threads erupt with historical claims. Kids in school learn the islands' names and memorize the official stance. What was once a no-man's land for fish and storms is now a stage where nationalism flexes in high definition. Still, amid all this tension, there's a strange rhythm. You notice it in the boat patterns. Japanese ships shadow, but rarely block. Chinese vessels approach, then retreat. no one fires, no one lands. The message is always, we're here, we're not leaving, but we're also not stupid. A quirky little scene comes to mind in 2016. A fleet of over 200 Chinese fishing boats, allegedly escorted by Chinese Coast Guard ships, entered the disputed waters. It was one of the largest incursions in years. Japan protested, China dismissed it. But no one escalated. It was like a flash mob, but with maritime patrols instead of choreography. You stand now on the highest point of Wutsurishima Eyes, sweeping the horizon. The boats move like chess pieces, their wakes slicing white lines through deep blue water. They don't speak. They don't need to. Their presence is the message. And somewhere far away in Tokyo and Beijing, diplomats draft statements they've written a dozen times before. The words may vary, but the theme is always the same: we will not yield. And the rocks, they remain utterly gloriously indifferent. Now the sea begins to ripple with a new layer of complexity, not with fog or boats or angry nationalists, but with something far more awkward: Taiwan. You gently drift sideways through the narrative, and suddenly you find yourself standing on a triangle, each corner a claimant to the same lonely rock, and none particularly fond of the other's company. You see, the Taiwan Strait is already one of the world's most sensitive bodies of water. But when it comes to the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, Taiwan adds an extra diplomatic twist, like sprinkling chili on a dish that was already too spicy. Because Taiwan, officially the Republic of China, also claims the islands, fiercely, consistently, and for a long time more vocally than even Beijing. That's not a typo. For much of the late 20th century, Taipei was the one filing diplomatic protests, commissioning historical research, and sending fishing boats to patrol near the islands. In fact, Taiwan's claim is rooted in the exact same historical documents that Beijing uses. Why? Because both the People's Republic of China (PRC) and the Republic of China (ROC) consider themselves successors of the same dynastic legacy, the Ming and Qing empires, whose maps and tribute missions are used to justify the claim. So technically, both Taiwan and mainland China believed the islands were stolen during the same historical wound, the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, and both believe they should have been returned after Diaoyu. The problem is, neither recognizes the other's legitimacy, so you end up with the geopolitical equivalent of two siblings fighting over a family heirloom they both insist belongs to only them, while refusing to acknowledge that the other is even in the family. Historians still argue whether Taiwan's claim is independent or merely a placeholder for Beijing's longer game. Some scholars say Taipei genuinely sees the islands as part of its national territory, citing old maps and Qing-era documents stored in Taiwan's own archives. Others suggest that the PRC tolerates Taiwan's activism because, hey, it still supports China's broader position, even if the two sides disagree about who runs China. It gets even messier when you add the US-Taiwan relationship to the mix. America doesn't recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country, not officially anyway, but it does sell Taiwan arms and has strategic interests in keeping Beijing from getting too comfortable. So when Taiwanese fishing boats get chased away from the islands by Japanese patrols and Taiwan complains, Beijing sometimes responds by saying nothing, or by issuing a vague statement that sort of supports them without really saying so. It's passive-aggressive nationalism at its finest. Then came a rare moment of clarity in 2013. Japan and Taiwan signed a fisheries agreement allowing Taiwanese boats to legally fish in some of the contested waters around the islands. This was huge. For years, Taiwanese fishermen had clashed with Japanese patrol boats. There were incidents involving water cannons, protest flotillas, and more than a few shouting matches broadcast on shaky phone footage. The agreement diffused some of the tension, at least temporarily. But here's where it gets extra weird. By signing the deal, Japan was basically acknowledging Taiwan's role in the region. That didn't sit well with Beijing, who viewed the move as dangerously close to treating Taiwan like a separate state. Still, China's official reaction was curiously muted, partly because the agreement didn't touch on sovereignty, just fishing, so everyone just sort of pretended it was fine, like waving to an ex at a party and then quickly checking your phone. Quirky detail alert: there was a moment in the 1990s when a Taiwanese activist actually tried to swim to the islands. Not sail, swim. He trained for months, had a support boat nearby, and made it surprisingly far before being intercepted by the Japanese Coast Guard. He didn't make it to the rocks, but he made it into the news and into nationalist legend. You can't help but marvel at this strange triangle of claimants. Japan administers the islands. China insists that's illegal. Taiwan also claims them but doesn't want to get lumped in with China politically. And all three countries know that pushing too hard could escalate into a regional crisis none of them actually wants. And that's the fragile balance. Each side wants to look strong. None of them wants to look reckless. Japan doesn't want to legitimize Taiwan's claim. China doesn't want Taiwan acting like an independent actor. And Taiwan wants to assert its historical rights without provoking a backlash from either of its two biggest neighbors. It's like watching three cats circling the same chair, all hissing, but none willing to sit first. The sea remains calm, but the political currents swirl. Each Coast Guard patrol, each map in a textbook, each small moment a commemorative stamp. Here, a protest there, adds to the growing layers of symbolism. The islands don't change, but their meanings do. So you hover again over Watsurishima, staring down at the rocky cliffs and the foamy waves, and somewhere between all the claims, you feel a strange truth. Settle in this triangle isn't about rocks, it's about recognition, about being seen, about proving a story is yours even if you weren't the first to tell it. And the island, it offers no verdict, just more wind. By now your ghostly feet have learned the island's ridges by heart, the way the wind carves hollows in the rock, the way salt spray stings without apology. But as the 21st century dawns and the island remains unmoved, the world around it begins to digitize, modernize and militarize. Satellites now watch from above. Radar stations listen like gossipy neighbors. And coast guards. They're still there, more determined than ever, playing what feels like the world's longest, most awkward staring contest. Welcome to the era of strategic symbolism, where every move matters, not because it changes the islands, but because it proves you're watching. And being seen, as you've come to learn, is half the battle. On the Japanese side, the policy is crystal clear. Japan controls the islands, full stop. They're administered by Ishigaki City in Okinawa Prefecture. You can write letters to that address. There are patrols, drones and surveillance equipment. No one lives there, but in Tokyo's view, that's irrelevant. They have presence, they have paperwork. End of debate, but not the end of tension. China has ramped up its response with a strategy known unofficially as grey zone operations actions that fall short of open conflict but constantly test Japan's patience. Chinese Coast Guard ships enter the waters around the islands regularly, sometimes daily, staying just long enough to provoke a reaction, never long enough to trigger war. It's like poking a sleeping cat and then saying, "I'm not touching you." These patrols are coordinated, sophisticated, sometimes synchronized with aerial flyovers by Chinese surveillance planes. Japan responds in kind, scrambling jets dispatching maritime assets, holding press conferences. The result is a continuous low-frequency hum of confrontation, like background music composed entirely of clenched jaws. Historians still argue whether these actions are purely defensive posturing or part of a broader strategy to normalize Chinese presence in the region. In other words, is this an annoying protest, or is it a long game to change the facts on the water? Japan certainly thinks it's the latter, and they've responded by doubling down militarily, legally and rhetorically. Here's a surprising little detail. In 2020, Japan passed legislation officially renaming the administrative zone containing the islands to include Senkaku in the name. Previously, it had a generic title, the new name Ishigaki Shi Tonoshiro Senkaku. Symbolic. Absolutely. Provocative. China certainly thought so. China, not to be outdone, passed its own law in 2021, authorizing its Coast Guard to use force, actual force, in waters it claims as sovereign, including around the Diaoyu Islands. This sent shockwaves through the region. Suddenly, the cat-and-mouse game had new rules. The ships weren't just playing tag anymore. There were now loaded weapons beneath those grey hulls. Yet even amid this escalation, neither side wants a full-blown clash. You hover above the scene, a Japanese patrol vessel trailing a Chinese one each, broadcasting calm messages over loudspeakers, each pretending this is just another Tuesday. They're not shouting, they're measuring. 1 degree off course, one overzealous young officer, and the whole situation could slide into chaos, but it doesn't. Somehow it doesn't. A curious moment from 2013 illustrates just how surreal this has become. A Chinese naval vessel reportedly locked its fire control radar onto a Japanese destroyer near the islands, essentially a pre-firing step. Japan protested furiously. China denied it. The incident sparked days of diplomatic outrage, but nothing came of it. No missiles, no apologies, just tensions smoothed over by silence and fatigue. And still the public watches. In China, nationalists post slick videos of maritime heroism drone flyovers set to stirring orchestral music. In Japan, right-wing groups charter boats to sail near the islands, waving flags and filming the moment like a pilgrimage. Both sides consume the conflict as content. Likes, shares, reposts. The island has become an actor in a play it never auditioned for. In Taiwan, meanwhile, the government maintains its claim but largely stays quiet, watching, carefully asserting rights in measured tones, making sure not to get squeezed between two giants while still flying its own flag of history. Their fishing fleets remain active in the area, and agreements with Japan occasionally help keep things calm. But the sentiment is always there: these rocks belong to us too. You begin to notice a rhythm to it all. Patrols, protests, diplomatic notes, then a brief lull. Like a tide, the tension recedes before rising again. A new prime minister in Japan, a new statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, a new naval exercise. Each one reactivates, the cycle stirs the waters. But the threshold of war never quite crossed. And there's the irony: everyone is armed, everyone is angry. But everyone is also incredibly careful. These aren't reckless countries. They know the stakes. A skirmish here could ignite alliances, drag in the United States, shift the entire balance of power in East Asia. So they walk the line one grey-hulled ship at a time. As you sit again atop Watsurishima, the sky now veiled in cloud, you hear the distant thrum of propellers. A Japanese helicopter passes overhead. Moments later, a Chinese drone zips across the sky. Neither sees you. You are invisible to them, just another ghost of history whispering across stone. And yet their presence affirms a truth that can't be ignored. These islands, however small, however bare, now sit at the center of one of the world's most finely tuned balances of peace and pride. And all the while, the rocks stay still. The ocean breathes beneath you, as it always has, deep, rhythmic, old. But now, in this century of high-definition conflict and legal pageantry, the waters around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands are not just physical space, they're also courtrooms. Invisible legal frameworks crisscross the sea like laser tripwires, and, floating above all of it, doing its best impression of a neutral referee, is the United Nations, silently sipping its coffee and wondering whether anyone will actually listen. Tonight you're dipping your toes into the world of international law, where everything sounds polite, but nothing ever gets resolved. At the center of it all, a 1982 agreement called UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Think of it as a very large, very complicated group project that tried to tell everyone where their oceanic toys could go. Under UNCLOS, countries can claim a territorial sea extending 12 nautical miles from their coastline, and an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, giving them special rights to resources like fish and oil. Sounds neat and tidy, right? Until you remember the Earth is round and coastlines aren't spaced out like school desks. When countries are close, say China, Japan and Taiwan, those zones start overlapping like a messy Venn diagram drawn by someone who's had too much coffee. So who decides who gets what? Ideally, negotiations. Realistically, arguments. And in the case of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, those arguments go in legal circles that never quite end. Japan insists the islands are indisputably its territory, administered since 1895 and again since the US handed them back in 1972. Therefore, any territorial sea or EEZ generated from them is Japanese. Period. China and separately Taiwan say not so fast. They claim the islands were historically Chinese, unjustly seized and should have been returned after WB under the terms of post-war declarations like the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Declaration. But here's the thing, while those documents stated that Japan should return territories it had taken by force, they never listed the islands by name. So historians and lawyers still argue whether that inclusion was implied or conveniently forgotten. And here's a fun legal loophole. UNCLOS doesn't actually determine sovereignty, only what maritime zones are generated by land that is already sovereign territory. So if you're arguing over who owns the land in the first place, UNCLOS shrugs and says, that's not my department. It's like asking your GPS which route to take when you haven't told it your destination. In 2016, China got a sharp reminder of this ambiguity. After losing a major case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration regarding its claims in the South China Sea, Beijing realized how international law could be used against it, but also how selectively enforceable that law really is. Because guess what? Despite the tribunal ruling against China's sweeping claims, nothing really changed. Why? Because there's no international ocean police, just lots of disappointed press conferences. And so in the case of the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute, no one wants to bring the issue to court because they might lose. Japan doesn't want to invite arbitration. It claims there's no dispute to arbitrate. China likewise would hate to formalize the issue in a forum where international precedent might not favor it. Taiwan, stuck in observer status, watching from the sidelines with a plate of fishing permits and zero legal recognition. Meanwhile, the UN itself avoids the subject like a hot stove. Its role is to encourage peace and stability, but not to declare winners in sovereignty disputes. That would require someone to give up a claim, and no one here is blinking. So the UN remains the world's most well-meaning bystander, nodding sympathetically, issuing calls for restraint, and very carefully not taking sides. Here's a weird little anecdote. In 2004, a group of Chinese activists who landed on the islands sent a letter to the United Nations asking it to recognize China's sovereignty. The response, a polite acknowledgement of receipt and nothing else. It was the diplomatic equivalent of getting left on read. Historians still argue whether international law can ever really solve this kind of dispute. Some point to cases like the ICJ's ruling over Pedra Branca, a small island disputed by Malaysia and Singapore, where both sides accepted the court's judgment. But those cases usually involve fewer people, fewer nukes, and way less historical trauma. In the East China Sea, nobody's willing to be the first to hand over the wheel. The one hopeful tool left is dialogue, back-channel discussions, fishing rights agreements, Coast Guard cooperation. And to be fair, there have been attempts. In 2014, China and Japan announced they'd reached a 4-point consensus to manage tensions, essentially agreeing to disagree while working to prevent escalation. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't even binding, but it was a start. Still, those good intentions get tested every time a ship crosses into our waters, every time a school textbook draws the map one way instead of the other, every time a politician decides to score points by being extra loud about the islands. You sit now at sea level, the legal frameworks floating invisibly above you like spider webs. You see the islands not as rock and brush, but as contested coordinates, tiny pieces of earth over which entire systems of law and memory collide. And just offshore, a drone buzzes by, not to shoot, not to spy, just to remind everyone we're still here. The law listens, the sea listens, but the rocks say nothing. You land now not on stone but on paper, not in waves but in words, thick, looping characters on rice paper, carefully typeset fonts in glossy government textbooks, animated segments in children's educational TV shows. You've entered the world of memory, not the kind that fades with age, but the kind meticulously curated by nations to last generations. Tonight you're sitting in the quietest but most powerful theatre of the conflict, the classroom. Because while Coast Guards play tag on the water, the real long game is being played in minds of school children, of future voters, of the next generation of officers, ministers, and protesters. And what they're being taught about those tiny islands isn't just history, it's identity. In Japan, you find yourself inside a tidy 6th grade social studies class. The textbook is recent, clean and firm in tone. The Senkaku Islands are described as an inherent part of Japan's territory. There's a map showing the archipelago clearly inside Japan's borders. There's no footnote suggesting a dispute, no caveat, just an assertion, calm and bureaucratic. Flip to the back of the book and you might find a brief mention of tensions, but usually with phrases like territorial misunderstanding with neighboring countries. That's not accidental. It's a strategic word choice sanded down to avoid heat while still asserting legal clarity. Now float across the sea to a Chinese classroom, perhaps in Fujian province, just across from Taiwan. The textbook here presents Diaoyu Dao with equal certainty, but entirely different context. Here, the islands are described as a sacred part of China's territory, since ancient times temporarily stolen by imperialist Japan and rightfully reclaimed by China's people. The map isn't just a diagram, it's a message. And the narrative is heavy with emotion, the legacy of war, the humiliation of colonization, the rise of a resurgent China reclaiming its dignity. Historians still argue whether these educational choices are purely patriotic or deliberately political. Most agree it's both. Education shapes perception, and perception shapes policy. When a 12-year-old learns that their nation's territorial integrity was violated, they don't forget it by the time they're 30 and working in a defense ministry or writing a viral blog post. And then there's Taiwan. Caught between the narratives of the other two, Taiwan's textbooks make a case of their own. Maps often include the islands labeled Diaoyu Tai, and the narrative echoes both mainland China's historical argument and Taiwan's unique administrative claim. But the emotional weight is different, less fiery, more procedural. Taiwan positions itself as the responsible custodian of overlooked history. Though under increasing pressure to streamline its identity apart from the mainland, it clings to its version of the islands as a symbol of heritage and presence. In all three places, the core message is the same. We are the rightful owners. The others are misinformed. And here is why you must remember that. The battle for the islands is not just maritime, it's mnemonic. A fringe tidbit surfaces here in the 2000s. A series of animated shorts produced by a Japanese right-wing group showed adorable characters representing each of Japan's claimed territories. The Senkaku Islands were depicted as a shy young girl with a ribbon, China. A large, angry male character trying to bully her. It was propaganda disguised as Saturday morning cartoons. The series was quietly removed after public backlash, but not before tens of thousands of views. The memes may be absurd, but the influence is real. And it goes both ways. Chinese state TV has aired multiple documentaries about the islands, complete with dramatic music-stylized recreations and professors lecturing from rooftops. A particularly popular episode showed an actor dressed as a Qing dynasty sailor, pointing at an old map and shouting, "We were here first," a bit theatrical. Sure, but you remember it, don't you? Because memory sticks when it's packaged with meaning, when it speaks not just to your logic, but to your belonging. You're sitting now in the back of a high school history class in Shanghai. The students are quiet, the teacher confident. The phrase territorial sovereignty appears again and again. Then a picture flashes on the screen, Japanese activists planting a flag on the island. The room shifts, eyes narrow, some students mutter. The message is sinking in. Now you're in Tokyo, same age group. A quiz question appears on the board. Name the 3 territories under dispute with neighboring countries. The answer, according to this class, the northern territories with Russia, Takeshima with South Korea, and Senkaku with China and Taiwan. Again, the framing is not neutral. Japan isn't in a dispute. Others are disputing with Japan. And you realize with a strange sense of calm that these students are not learning about islands. They're learning who they are. In each classroom, you feel the same quiet certainty. The children trust their teachers. The teachers trust their textbooks. The textbooks trust the ministry. And the ministry trusts a centuries-old narrative that has been edited, updated, reinforced, and wrapped around every shoreline and flagpole. You hover now above the 3 nations, listening to school bells ring, chalk on boards, mouse clicks on e-learning modules. The sea is invisible from here, but the islands, they're etched into every mind. And the rocks themselves, still silent, still uninhabited, still patiently absorbing the weight of memory pressed into them by people who've never stepped foot there, but believe with utter certainty that it belongs to them. As evening falls once more over the East China Sea, the wind picks up not the soothing kind, but the kind that carries static. A shift in atmosphere. You feel it before you hear it. A jet engine hums somewhere far above. A patrol boat adjusts its heading just slightly. And across social media feeds in Tokyo, Beijing, and Taipei hashtags flicker to life. You've entered the realm of modern tension, where war doesn't start with a cannon, but with a statement, or worse, a gesture. The question hangs heavy now. Could a war really start over this? Over rocks with no residents, no natural harbors, no monuments? You already know the answer. No one wants to say out loud. Yes. But not the kind of war you imagine. Not trenches, not bombs. More like sparks, more like slips. You revisit 2010 when a Chinese fishing trawler collided accidentally or not with two Japanese Coast Guard ships near the islands. Japan arrested the captain, prompting China to suspend rare earth mineral exports, cancel diplomatic meetings, and block visas. It was the diplomatic version of a punch thrown with a glove. The captain was eventually released, but the message was clear: mess with the Diaoyu and you will feel it. Then came 2012, when Japan's central government purchased 3 of the islands from a private Japanese family to prevent Tokyo's nationalist governor from doing so and causing chaos. Ironically, this preemptive calming move triggered nationwide protests in China. Car windows were smashed, Apple stores vandalized, factories with Japanese ties were shuttered by spontaneous demonstrations. The anger was real, the strategy behind it ambiguous. Historians still argue whether these flare-ups were spontaneous expressions of nationalism or quietly sanctioned pressure tactics. Most likely, they were both. Governments don't need to start the fire, they just need to know how to aim the smoke. Then there was 2013, when China declared an Air Defense Identification Zone (ADIZ) over the East China Sea, which, surprise, encompassed the islands. China demanded that all aircraft entering the zone file flight plans and obey its rules. Japan refused, so did the US, which promptly flew 2 B-52 bombers through the zone without notifying Beijing. No weapons were fired, but in military speak that's the equivalent of walking into someone's living room, sitting on their couch, and turning on the TV. A year later, Chinese warships and Japanese planes were routinely brushing past each other, sometimes within meters. One report claimed a Chinese frigate locked its fire control radar onto a Japanese destroyer. That's the last step before firing a missile. Japan filed a protest, China denied it, and the incident was filed away in a folder titled, "Let's hope this doesn't happen again." You sit atop Watsurishima now, imagining how little it would take. One over-eager pilot, one ship commander too proud to retreat, one trending video showing a supposed insult. And suddenly every news anchor in the world is saying it all began over a tiny, uninhabited island. That's the fear. But also the discipline. Because even with all the tension, all the rhetoric, no bullets have flown, no missiles have launched, no soldiers have died for these islands yet. Why? Because deep down the people who steer these ships and sign these orders know the truth. No one wins. Japan risks conflict with a nuclear-armed China. China risks global backlash, potential US involvement, and economic isolation. Taiwan, already politically precarious, can't afford escalation from either side. And let's not forget the wild card, the United States. Under the US-Japan Security Treaty, America is obligated to defend Japan if attacked, including, as confirmed by several presidents, if such an attack occurs over the Senkaku Islands. That clause alone turns every skirmish into a loaded chessboard. One quirky story from 2014 captures the fragility. A Chinese civilian drone was spotted near the islands. Japan prepared to shoot it down, prompting China to warn that doing so would be considered an act of war. Japan blinked. The drone flew away. No war. But the sheer fact that a plastic propeller toy almost triggered a crisis tells you how thin the ice is. You imagine a video game with the difficulty set to maximum. No room for error, no margin for sarcasm. Every action, every public comment, every Coast Guard maneuver is weighed not just for what it does, but for what it might accidentally do. So you float between ships again. You hear calm voices over radios. This is the Japan Coast Guard. You are entering Japanese waters. Please turn back. Silence. Then a reply. This is China Maritime Safety Administration. These are Chinese waters. We urge you to leave. Both ships maintain course. Both log the conversation, and the ocean ever-patient shrugs. Historians still argue whether these daily standoffs are acts of deterrence or quiet aggression. Most agree they're both. They are gestures with volume knobs, sometimes loud, sometimes almost imperceptible, but always present. And beyond the strategy, there are people. Crews spending days at sea. Officers studying radar blips, drinking instant noodles at midnight, sending texts home like another patrol. Same place. Same story. You wonder if they're tired, if they know they're part of something bigger than themselves, if they dream of the islands like you do, silent, wind-swept, indifferent. And you begin to understand this isn't about war. It's about almost war. And how long nations can live in that space without falling in. The islands don't want conflict. They don't want anything, but they're perfect places to argue over. Small enough to feel manageable, symbolic enough to carry enormous weight, and just dangerous enough to keep everyone guessing. So you lie down one more time on Utsuri Shima, the air cool, the sky overcast. The sea murmurs. Patrol boats continue their vigil. And the wind carries a whisper, equal parts warning and lullaby. Not today, but maybe tomorrow. And now you arrive at the present, calmer maybe, but not settled. The air above the islands feels heavy with the weight of too many decades, too many declarations. Still the sea sparkles faintly as it always does, pretending not to care. But you know better. These rocks, these lifeless specks in the sea, have become more than geography. They are symbols. And symbols, unlike stone, never erode. You gaze across the jagged skyline of Utsuri Shima eyes, tracing the same ridges that sailors once used for navigation, now studied through binoculars by coast guards, journalists and diplomats. The island itself hasn't changed, but what it means that shifts every year. To Japan it is proof of a modern lawful order. To China it is a scar from a century of humiliation. To Taiwan it is an inheritance quietly insisted upon. And to the rest of the world it is a cautionary tale about what happens when memory refuses to let go. Because at this point, it's not even really about who needs the island, it's about who deserves it, who's earned it, who has the older maps, the more effective control, the more moral claim. It's about whose story survives. Take Japan. It continues to administer the islands without soldiers, but with firm resolve. It keeps the area under surveillance, sends in the Coast Guard, and reiterates its position with calm repetition. There is no territorial dispute, but of course there is. Japan just doesn't want to admit that acknowledging it gives it life. China, meanwhile, has made the islands a cornerstone of its maritime rights campaign. Its ships don't go to war, they go to be seen. Its diplomatic statements echo like mantras. Diaoyu Islands has been China's territory since ancient times, over and over, as if repetition alone can shape the tide. And Taiwan. Still sending fishermen, still issuing claims, still reminding anyone who will listen that it too has ancient maps and legal arguments. But with shrinking diplomatic space, its voice echoes softer. Historians still argue whether the current calm is sustainable or just the eye of a storm. They point to rising military budgets, populist politics, the regional arms race, and the increasingly digitized warfare of the modern age. One wrong move, one misread radar ping could reignite everything, and yet no war, not yet. And there have been small signs of hope too. Crisis hotlines have been installed between governments. Coast Guard officers have been trained in de-escalation. Agreements, shaky and informal, have allowed for temporary fishing rights, shared monitoring, even joint marine research. There's something oddly human in that. Amid all the national pride and geopolitical tension, people are still trying to find ways to work together, even while pretending not to. And here's something poetic: no one has ever lived on these islands. Not permanently, not comfortably. They are harsh, wind-blasted, storm-prone. They offer no farmland, no fresh water, no shelter. They are not a prize in any practical sense. And yet they remain precious, not because of what they give, but because of what they hold: history, dignity, stories. You now drift one final time over the jagged rocks, listening to the sounds of engines, faraway gulls circling water, lapping against unbothered stone. The sun is setting again. Patrol boats switch on their lights. Someone somewhere is writing another policy memo. Someone else is teaching a class on sovereignty, and a child in Tokyo or Taipei or Beijing is hearing for the first time that these islands are theirs. And still the rocks say nothing. They wait. They endure. And maybe, just maybe, they hope the people arguing over them might one day forget to argue. Might one day see each other not as rivals, but as neighbors who share the same sea, the same storms, the same salt in their bones. Because after all this time, the most radical thing that could happen here is nothing. No more landings, no more chases, no more statements, just silence. Just peace. I'd stay here a little longer. And now the water stills. The engines fade. The ships become silhouettes. Whatever noise the world had planned for these islands, it has quieted for now. You sit on a stone knees drawn to your chest, watching the sky bleed gold, then indigo, then black. The wind softens to a whisper. Even the gulls grow quiet. You hear the hush of waves brushing against rock, the distant hum of a drifting ship engine, barely audible. There is no argument left tonight, no claim, no protest, no slogan, just the natural rhythm of a sea older than sovereignty. Let your mind drift like a buoy bobbing gently on the water. Let the tension fade with the light, the urgency dissolve into the horizon. The rocks are still here. The people are still watching. But for now, there is nothing left to do but breathe. The island exhales, so do you. Let the waters carry you into stillness. Let your thoughts, slow soften, disappear. The island doesn't need you to solve anything. It only asks that you rest. So close your eyes. The waves are steady. The sky is safe. The stars begin to bloom. And the world for one long moment feels very far away.